Hey guys, welcome back to my Practically Imperfect Life. I've had some requests for a video on how I do canning because I talk a lot about why we garden and saving our food and all of that stuff. And tonight I'm actually going to be working on applesauce and apple pie filling, so I thought what a perfect time to just kind of show you what it is I'm doing. Now, it's a messy job, so I am dressed down, I have no makeup on, you get me kind of raw and unfiltered tonight. But anyways, I just thought it might be fun to share. I also think the science behind why canning works is really cool. So if you have a student who is maybe studying chemistry, or if they're doing in their science classes information on like heat and how things expand and contract and creating vacuums, canning is actually a great way to demonstrate that and why it preserves our food. So for my friends who are using Guest Hollow's Chemistry in the Kitchen, here you go. This is chemistry in action. All right, so what do I need to get started? There are some tools that I have that aren't necessary, but they are awfully helpful to use. But you do, of course, have to start with jars. I like the Ball Mason jar brands. These are the ones that you find everywhere, like all the time, especially in the fall when everyone's harvesting. I'm going to be doing some larger sizes today. I sometimes will do the smaller pints, but because we go through applesauce pretty fast, like when we open it up, we'll eat it warm, we'll add it to things we're baking. I'm going to use the larger ones. I'm going to use the same size for my apple pie filling as well, because that is just something else, again, that we go through like crazy. So I can reuse the jars from year to year, and I can reuse the screw tops, but I do have to purchase new lids each year, and that's because they've got a special seal on them. And so if you try to reuse these, there's a good chance that they won't seal properly and your food won't be preserved. So I typically won't save these once I've opened and used up things. I'll just get new ones every year. You do want to make sure that your jars are sterilized before you put anything in them. Now you can sterilize them a couple of different ways. I have a sterilizing setting on my dishwasher, so I can run just jars through there and have them sterilized that way. Sometimes I'll just get some water boiling and I'll let them sit in the water for a little while, and then I'll pull them out. Plus that keeps the jars nice and hot, because you do want the jars hot when you're putting your applesauce or your apple pie filling into them. So I'm actually going to be getting a big pot of water going, and I'm going to sterilize them that way today. Now the lids and the screw tops, you can just wash these in some hot soapy water and set them aside. You don't need to like sterilize these the same way that you need to do the jar. So that is what I'm going to end up doing with those. A couple of other tools that I have. I do have just a funnel to help me get things into the jar. This is especially helpful when you're doing the smaller pint-sized jars, because it's really easy to just splash what you're pouring all over the place, and you're usually pouring things that are already quite hot, and you don't want to get any injuries. Then I have this tool. Now this has measurements on the side there, and I don't know if they will show up on the camera. They probably won't, but they are noted at 1 inch, 3/4 inch, 1/2 inch, and 1/4 inch, because most canning recipes will tell you how much head space you need to leave in your jar. So that's the distance from where your filling ends and the top of the jar is, and it's different for different things. So for example, you might need a 1/2 inch head space for one thing and 1 inch head space for another, so you do want to refer to the recipe. Now the other end is actually meant to be put into your mixture once it's in the jar. Stir it around to help get air bubbles out, because you do not want to trap air bubbles in your jar. It can change, you know, how well it's going to seal, and again, how well it'll preserve. And then this one I actually think is kind of necessary. So this is a can holder. So I use this to pick up my jars, put them into the hot water, pull them back out. And so I find that super helpful so I don't burn myself. Now, I'm going to be using my good old-fashioned water bath canner tonight for this. Most canning recipes you can do in a water bath canner. This is one that I actually inherited from my grandma. So this one is quite old. It has done a lot of canning in its days. There are recipes that are ones that you should use a pressure canner for, and I can throw up a picture of the pressure canner that I have. That one works very similar to like a pressure cooker. It's going to build up pressure within the pot. That would be what you would use for things like green beans, and that's one of the few things that I do use that one for. You can can all of these other things in the pressure canner, so if you don't want to have two, you could just have the pressure canner and then you can do it in there. I inherited this for free, so I'm going to use it. So it's obviously quite large, and then it has a rack that goes into the bottom, and that is to make sure that our jars are not touching the bottom of our pot, because you don't want them sitting right on the bottom of the pot. So what I will do is I will actually get this filled up with water, and I'm going to start heating it up now, even before I start on my apples, because it just takes so long for this amount of water to heat up and get nice and hot to where I can use it for my canning process. So I'm gonna get this filled up and going on the stove. Now, another thing that you might see is behind me on my mixer, I have an attachment on there. Again, not necessary, but it's something that I actually got this year to try to save me some time, and it has saved me a ton of time, especially when I was canning tomato sauce. So it is a combination meat grinder and food strainer. So KitchenAid makes their own brand. This is actually an off-brand from Amazon. It's a KitchenAid brand, and I can link it down below if you'd like to check it out. I can't tell you how the longevity is on it because I've only had it for this harvest season. However, it has been so nice because what it does is it allows you to take softened fruits and vegetables and run it through there, and it'll take the seeds and the skins and it'll spit them out one end, and then it will bring your nice smooth mixture into a bowl, so that way you don't have to sit there and try to take the seeds out of every single apple or every single tomato. All you have to do is get them soft enough that they can go through that grinder. So it saved me so much time with the tomatoes that I'm looking forward to using it for the apples. Because of that, I am gonna have to get the apples softened. So I'm gonna be slicing my apples up into quarters, making sure I take off the stem, take off the blossom, and then I'm gonna put them in some water and basically just kind of simmer them until they're soft. Like, I'm not worrying about the seeds, I'm not worrying about the skins yet, because all of that will come out with the food strainer. It's just, oh, it's so, so helpful. So that is the first thing we're gonna do. I'm gonna get water boiling, and then I'm gonna start slicing up some apples and get them simmering on the stove. And then I'll kind of take you through the process and talk you through it as I go. So I might do a little bit of a voiceover in this video just because some of these processes are quite long and loud, and I will just fast forward through them so you can see what I'm doing but not have to listen to the food grinder going on and on and on for 30 minutes. But let's just go ahead and get started. So as I got these apples ready, I put them on the stove with just a little bit of water so they could start to soften. It didn't take more than a few minutes per batch. So I was constantly putting apples into the water to simmer and then feeding them into the food strainer. And you can see I have applesauce basically coming out into the pot on the left, and all of those things I don't want, the skin and the seeds and the cores, coming out to the right. Yeah, it looks a little gross, but it worked so well. I mean, just look at that applesauce coming out ready to go. Okay, after repeating that process for a full bushel of apples, this is what I have. So you can see it's a pretty good size pot full of applesauce, and there is all the waste that it popped out. Ugh, gross. And just to be real transparent, this is the mess that I have. So all of these pieces come apart, and then I will clean them all in like hot soapy water. So I'm gonna let it cool because the apples were quite hot going into there, but then I'll take it apart and I'll wash all of those bits. So what I'm gonna do next though is I'm actually gonna add, this is probably a double batch, and each batch takes about 3 tablespoons of lemon juice. So I'm gonna go ahead and add 6 tablespoons of lemon juice to this. And I'm going to put this on heat and get it boiling. So you do want it to be boiling about 212 degrees, and then you want to maintain that boiling while you're filling the jar. So we want this to be hot, hot, hot. Now this is also the point, if you want to have sweetened applesauce, you can add sugar to it. What I'm gonna do is I'm gonna get it to boiling. I'm gonna fill half my jars, and then I'm gonna add cinnamon to the rest. So I'm gonna have some cinnamon applesauce and some plain. But I'm just gonna use the same pot for both. I have got my jars sterilizing in some boiling water. They're ready to come out. So I'm gonna get those out and going while this is heating up. But first, let's get the lemon juice added. This recipe calls for 3 tablespoons of lemon juice for every 7 to 10 pounds of apples that you use or so. Since I doubled the recipe, I'm adding a full 6 on here, and I'm going to heat this all up to boiling, which we'll explain why that's important later. And then I'm using my funnel to get it into the jars so you can see how helpful that is to make sure that that hot applesauce ends up exactly where I want it to be and not all over my hands. All right, so let me show you a little bit of how I use this tool to measure for the headspace. So I'm gonna set it right there with the 1/2 inch on top, and I can see if I need to add a little bit to my jar. So I need to add just a wee bit so it's filled to right about there. That's about a 1/2 inch of headspace. And then if I need to, I'll take this down and I'll use that to get rid of any air bubbles before I put the lid on. So I'm just gonna do that, and then These guys are ready to have their lids put on and get going in the processor. Now I can start processing these jars. I'm gonna get them in my water bath canner, which is already filled with quite hot water, and I wanna make sure that all of the jars are covered by about an inch of water. I'm gonna turn the heat up, get it back to a strong boil, put the lid on, and then I'm gonna process them at that boiling point for about 20 minutes, after which I'll take the lid off and I'll let them sit for 5 minutes before I take them out of the water bath canner. I'm gonna put them on a towel on my counter, let them start to cool for anywhere from 12 to 24 hours. You might hear that pop sound as the jars kind of form that vacuum seal, and you can see that I'm just testing the lids, make sure that there's that little concave bit in the middle, there's no flexibility in the lids, and I know that they are ready to store. Now, I'm of course a bit of a science geek, so I want to share the science behind why canning foods works. And there are two goals. First of all, we want to try to destroy bacteria that's causing food spoilage, especially this Clostridium bacterium that causes botulism, food poisoning. And so we need to have a high enough temperature to kill that bacteria. But we also want to create a vacuum within the jars and have a good seal to prevent microorganisms from being reintroduced to the jars. The other thing we have to take into account is the natural acidity of foods that we are processing. So things like green beans, they have a very high pH normally. They are not very acidic, so they have to be processed in a pressure canner, which will create high enough temperatures to kill bacteria. When we're doing things like tomato sauces, you typically have to add lemon juice or citric acid, and then you notice that I added lemon juice to my applesauce. So the combination of this increased acidity level or a lower pH on top of the heat from boiling and the heat from the processing of the jars will ensure that that bacteria is all killed. Now, the lids and how they seal is also really important. So I mentioned that I use brand new lids every year because I want to have a fresh gasket, that little red lining you sort of saw on all of those lids. What happens is as it's heating up during the processing is that is starting to soften and flow over the edge of the jars, but it's still allowing air to escape, which we want to happen. That's why I don't put the screw tops on super tight when I'm getting ready to process my jars. And what will happen is it will soften and flow over them, allowing that air to escape. But then as those jars cool, that will start to firm up and it will create a good solid seal, and things inside the jar will cool. And then as they cool, they shrink down and it creates a vacuum. And that's when you start to get then that telltale pop that tells you that your cans are good for storage. And there you go. That is my recipe for how I make and can applesauce and a little bit of the science behind why it works. Thanks so much for joining me for today's video, everybody. I hope you enjoyed it. I will see you in the next one. And until then, happy homeschooling.